What is that smell? I am definitely getting a hint of a deal. Oh wait, it's more than a hint. Yeah, these are the best deals, and not just this season, but all year long. In all seriousness, the smartest shoppers know that you get the brands you love with the most savings and cash back with Rakuten. And I know I'm certainly interested in sniffing out those deals. Start getting cash back at your favorite stores like Urban Outfitters, Petco, even Expedia, and getting cash back doesn't mean you have to miss out on sales because those can be stacked right on top. It's easy to use and based on a simple idea. Stores pay Rakuten for sending them shoppers, and Rakuten shares the money with you as cashback through PayPal or check. Smells like a perfect deal to me. Download the free Rakuten app and never miss a deal. Or go to Rakuten.com to start getting the most bang for your buck. That's Rakuten.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, Canadian Heritage Minute, (S), Minutes. This is a series of mini episodes that are inspired by the classic Historic Canada Canadian Heritage Minutes. Those were 60-second commercials about things in Canadian history, and this is a slightly longer thing where I talk about stuff in Canadian history, and that's because what the fuck is happening? Jesus Christ. Yeah. Just for a quick, I really want to get to the story. I want to focus on just the history story I'm here to tell you, which is I'm really excited about. But first, just some updates in this audio journal that is this podcast now, apparently. My name is Anne Foster. I'm a Canadian person. I currently live in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Treaty 6 territory, homeland of the Métis. I was born on the East Coast in Nova Scotia. And historically, I've always been a history fan. And I think part of the reason is because I grew up in Nova Scotia, which compared to other places in Canada has kind of some of the oldest existing buildings because Canada was settled. Thousands of groups of people lived on this whole continent before Canada was settled. But Canada, as it is now, was first colonized by the French and the British in the 18th century. And they started from the East Coast and worked their way west. And so the oldest places you're going to find in Canada are more towards the East Coast. And that's where I grew up. And there were cool things around where I live. There's lots of old stone structures, lots of ghost stories, lots of stuff about fishermen and things. There's also a lot of women's history I did not learn about. And today we're going to be talking about another Nova Scotian person. But first, update about Elbows Up, Canada uniting in rage patriotism, still going on. No reason to stop. And my update for you is that it's bringing some weird feelings up in me, and I presume, and a lot of other people, about who we're suddenly cheering on, who we're happy to see supporting us. So recently, King Charles III, who you might know as Camilla's husband, Diana's ex, Harry's dad, not a man I've ever really felt like, oh, hooray, he's the king, and I'm cool with that. Although I will say that I have a book coming out next year, Rebel of the Regency, a biography of Caroline of Brunswick, and I am waiting for Buckingham Palace to give permission for us to use a painting that they have the rights to in my book. So I'm cool with Charles at the moment, but I'm really cool with Charles at the moment because the British monarch isn't allowed to make statements about political stuff, but he recently did a ceremonial thing where he was planting a tree, and it was a maple tree with red leaves, kind of like the Canada flag. He showed up to this military engagement wearing, so Canada is part of the Commonwealth. He is our king, Charles. And he showed up wearing his honorary Canadian military outfit. Queen Elizabeth, his mom, used to do stuff where it's oh, she's wearing this brooch, oh, she's wearing this color, and people read into it to be oh, these are the sort of messages she's trying to send in as best as she can through her outfits. And he's supporting Canada, and I was shocked to find myself heartened and glad. Never in my life have I ever thought oh, I hope Charles steps up for me and for Canada. And I'm just like, wow, Charles and I are on the same team. Wild. So every province has a premier. I think in the US, your states have like governors. So the premier of Ontario is a guy called Doug Ford, who has just been the absolute worst. Conservative, just like blowhard, just like not a person I've ever had any fond feelings about, really. But he's been sort of stepping up in a way where I'm just like, I'm on the same team gladly as Doug Ford and King Charles. Strange. And then there's a moment where, so our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, just stepped down. We have a new Prime Minister who's just sworn in, Mark Carney, and he's from the Liberal Party. That's what the party is called. Doug Ford is a conservative person, allied with the Conservative Party. And the two of them met for breakfast in like a diner, and they took a picture of them smiling together. And I was just like, fuck yeah, boys. And I'm just like, what am I talking about? How am I cheering for these two like white men having a diner meal? But I'm like, yeah, me, those two guys, King Charles, the whole country of Canada, elbows up. It's a fucking weird time. Growing up in Canada in the 1980s and 1990s, first of all, as a child, you read Robert Munsch, Canadian author. His book's still popular. And then when you're in like middle school, you would read Gordon Corman books and you would read Martin Godfrey books. Martin Godfrey, R.I.P., he passed quite a long time ago. But one of his books, and I loved his books growing up, it's called, I believe, I Spent My Summer Vacation Kidnapped into Space. And it was about this boy and a girl, and they were kidnapped into space. And there's a whole thing where they had to, at one point, they're in sort of a gladiator arena, and they had to face off against these giant space aliens. And then they realized, like, oh, wait, these are basically giant slugs. And you know how to deal with slugs? Throw salt at them. And then they defeated them. And that's how I still to this day remember throw salt at slugs. Is that true? I don't know. But I often sometimes think about the situation in that book where it's like, what if I was kidnapped by space aliens? And it was like me and one other human. It's like, it could be somebody who you would never get along with. Like as a kid, I'd be like, what if it was a kid in my class I don't like? Or, you know, when you're in grade 3, it's like, what if it's a kid in grade 6, you know, some like cooler, older kid, where it's just like someone you would never be friends with, someone from a different clique. And as an adult, I think, like, what if it's somebody I have political differences with? But if you're on this planet, in this gladiator arena, facing these giant slug aliens, it's like, you got to band together because the enemy of your enemy is your friend or whatever. Like, you just inherently band together with the only other human being there. And I have thought to myself, many times over the last decade, that there's a lot of people that I think, like, probably most human beings I think would be cool teaming up with against the slugs, except for some of the people running America right now who I think I would sacrifice to the slugs. Like, there's some people where it's just like, even if we were the only humans and us teaming up stood between me and death, like, I would choose death over teaming up with some of these people. Like, I can't bother with it. Which brings us to today's story. Because today's story, and actually, thank you to my very good friend and Canadian consultant, Marlene, who knows more than anyone I know about Canadian actors, Canadian TV shows, Canadian content. And so when I was doing this series, I was like, who's someone I should talk about? And she said, Mona Parsons, a name I had never heard. I looked it up and I was just like, oh my God, I have to cover this story. And so where this story, first of all, this is the second episode of the Vulgar History Canadian Heritage Minutes. And I think sequentially, I want to present different people from Canadian history. And then when you put them together in a mosaic, you can kind of see the vibe, what this country is about. If you don't know about Canada, you don't know about Canadian history, like I'll paint you a picture of the sorts of people who live here and who helped create the country that we now live in, which is a very multicultural country. This is a story it took place in the 20th century. It gets into World War II type stuff. And it also shows you that what Mona Parsons exemplifies is that women in Canadian history, people in Canadian history, contain multitudes. And when we see something, when we see an injustice, when we see something is shitty, like the best people in this country, which is a lot of us, want to step up and do the right thing. And we are anti-Nazi in this country. And she faced off against the Nazis. And it's a classic vulgar history type story. If you've heard my regular podcast that I do, regular vulgar history episodes are usually an hour and a half. Sometimes I get carried away. It turns into a 5-part series. But I like a story with twists and turns and twists and turns. And it keeps changing and pivoting. And this is I'll tell you the story. Now I've got us all worked up. I will say this is another person. There is a literal Canadian Heritage Minute about this. It came out in the early 2000s, which was a time at which I was watching less television with commercials. So I had not seen it before, but I'm glad, just so you know, that she's got that. She's got the Canada Post stamp and she's got the Canadian Heritage Minute, which is how you know this is a Canadian goddamn legend. Mona Parsons. And I do want to also say that my source for this is monaparsons.ca, which is a website done by a writer called Andrea Hill-Lair, who also wrote a book called Mona Parsons, From Privilege to Prison, From Nova Scotia to Nazi Europe. And that's why we know the story. That's why there is a Canadian Heritage Minute. That's why there is a stamp, because Andrea Hill-Lair heard about this woman who lived in the same city where Andrea lives and just started digging and finding this story. And like, because of her dogged pursuit of this, we now know the story and now I can share it with you. And she has a website, monaparsons.ca, where I abridged how she tells the story there to share it with you. So Mona Parsons. Also, actually, one more thing I want to point out, which as I go through these episodes, I want to talk about all kinds of different women from Canadian history, of all kinds of different cultures and ethnicities and experiences, genders and everything. And Mona Parsons is a white woman, and this is like the sort of white woman I aspire to be, which is someone who is helping, someone who is not just an ally, someone who is an advocate, someone who is an alibi, someone who is an accessory, like someone who's just like in the dirt, doing the work, using her privilege to help other people who don't have that privilege. So, an icon for white women and for everybody. Mona Parsons was born February 17th, 1901 in the town of Middleton in Nova Scotia. So her father was a businessman and her mother looked after their home and 2 sons. So she had 2 brothers. When she was 10 years old, Mona, her father's business burnt to the ground, which devastated the town. And so basically they pieced out of there. They left this town and they moved to Wolfville, which is the nearby city, which is a city that is still there. And so while there, Mona attended school at the Acadia Ladies Seminary. And while there, she got her first taste of live theater and performing, because touring companies and amateur performances were put on there. And then it turns out she was really good. She had a natural gift and she was trained in acting and in singing. And so this eventually led to her being cast in some of these plays. And as a former theater kid, I vibe with this teenage saga. When she was 13 years old, World War I broke out. Canada, like all the countries in the world, was involved in this, fighting on the Allies' side. And so Canada has always been, in my understanding, World War I, World War II, like Canada really, what we're feeling now, this like rage patriotism, I think there was a similar vibe that people are just like, we're doing this war and we're going to do it. So she's 13 years old and she helped out as best as she could as a 13-year-old in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. She knitted socks for soldiers. She engaged in community activities to support the troops and the war effort. I would presume that would involve maybe she would do some performances and then donate the money, that sort of thing. Her father and her 2 brothers enlisted, and her brother Ross was wounded in 1917. And this was a real turning point for Mona Parsons. She went from being kind of like small town Canadian girl doing theater to just being like, oh fuck, like she had an awakening. She had an aha moment about like the world is a bigger place and injustices were happening. And she wanted to be on the right side of history. So she also saw at this point, like so many men went off to fight in the war, so many men died in the war, and the women left at home had to pick up the slack and do all the work. And so she saw that women had to take control of farms and businesses. They took on roles as nurses near the battlefront. And she saw like, oh, like these are things women can do. And she was like, I want a life where I do things. I want more than being a wife and a mother. Maybe I want that too, but I want to be a strong, independent woman, and I want to do things to be on the right side of history. So she graduated with a certificate in elocution, which I believe means just having beautiful speech and singing and giving speeches and things like that. Then she went to school in Boston, and throughout the 1920s, she moved back and forth between Wolfville and the U.S. She took classes at Acadia University, which is still there in Wolfville. And then she also taught elocution. Like she was so good, she was able to teach it at Central College in Arkansas. And then eventually, do you know where this bitch landed? She landed a role in the Ziegfeld Follies in New York. The Ziegfeld Follies was like the musical theater review. This is like the place to be. Like, I don't know, like imagine like the Rockettes times all of Broadway times. Like this is the place to be if you want to be a young woman who's performing. The Ziegfeld Follies, that is it. And so she got there and she's just like on the big stage in New York City, like dreaming the dream. And just imagine how, I mean, we know she's skilled. She can act, she can sing, she can dance. She's also gorgeous. And then when you're there, you know, wealthy men would go and they would want to kind of like have dates with the women in the Ziegfeld Follies. But she was like, I want still more. She wanted roles in plays like she did back in Wolfville, like where she wasn't just kind of like using her looks and dancing. She wanted to like really dig deep and do something she was passionate about. But before she could kind of shift her focus to doing that sort of acting, she got a telegram, horrible news. Her mother back in Wolfville had a stroke. And so she went back home, and shortly after she arrived, her mother had a second stroke and died. Mona was now 29 years old. In those days, I mean, we still have this now, but especially back then, there was a real like, ladies don't tell their age. But like 29 was older for a showgirl in those days. And I think she would also, like a lot of us, when I was around that age, I had a real like, what am I doing with my life type moment. So it's 1929. The stock market crashed. So the world was in a depression. So she knew she needed a solid career. And this is really honestly similar to how I became a librarian, which is my job. Because I was just like, I want a career type job. I want something with longevity, a pension. She wanted something that would provide stability in tough times. And so she thought back to the stories she'd heard from her family about like the nurses in World War I. That's the way that you can help. That's the way you can give back. That's what the job at that point in 1929 that women could do. And she was also influenced by seeing her mother when she had the stroke, and the nurses that she saw who were treating her. And so she enrolled in the Jersey School of Medicine to become a nurse. She graduated with honors in 1935 and landed a job in New York City at a Park Avenue ear, nose, and throat specialist. In the first of several coincidences, this man was actually from Nova Scotia as well. The thing about Nova Scotia back then, now a bit, but back then, it's like you're only ever 1 to 2 degrees of separation from someone who you both know. It's a province, but it's a small town that's also a province. So it's still the Great Depression, right? But because of her career choice, because of her skills, she was an independent woman embarking on a solid career with a good future, living in one of the most cosmopolitan cities in North America, New York City. And then 1937. Remember, she has brothers. So one of her brothers at this point was based in Rhode Island, and he called her one day to ask a favor. A guy was just doing a business trip, and he was wondering, like, could you show this guy, just like tour him around, show him all the sights of New York City? And she's like, sure. Like, she's a game. She's up for it. She's like happy to do a favor for her brother. And so she met this guy, this business associate, whose name is Willem Leonhardt. Willem was Dutch, and he was a millionaire. His business was selling plumbing fixtures. So like pipes and sinks and things. You know what? Of course you become a millionaire in 1937 from your family business of plumbing fixtures, because his family's business had started a couple of decades ago, laying the foundation of modern water and sewer systems in Amsterdam. Like, this is like in Europe, especially, there's a lot of old buildings and old places that want to have running water, and his company was the people who are installing that. And so also in this era, Hollywood films were showing bathrooms as these like decadent Art Deco, amazing places to go. And so they met, love at first sight. A few days later, Willem had to go on another business trip. He had to go to Mexico. But before he left, so he went to Mexico, came back a few weeks later, paused in New York City long enough to propose marriage. And she accepted. And in September, they got married. Well, they went to Holland and then they got married. They went for honeymoon along the French and Italian Rivieras. And then upon returning to Holland, they purchased land in Laren, where they built a 3-story dream home surrounded by lavish gardens, and they called the estate Ingleside. Now, did they name this estate after Ella Montgomery's book, Rilla of Ingleside? Who's to say? But that's another East Coast person. Rilla of Ingleside being the daughter of Anne Shirley from Anne of Green Gables, Ellen Montgomery being the author of Anne of Green Gables. I did an episode of Vulgar History a year or two ago about Ellen Montgomery that you could look up if you want to learn more about her. So they're just like living their life. And this is where it reminds me of now. Because like World War I happened. Mona's like, I've lived through unprecedented times. Now here we are, amazing, precedented times. Living in Holland in 1937. What could go wrong? World War II, baby, is what happened. In May 1940, Holland was invaded by Nazi Germany. Holland surrendered, and the country was occupied for 5 years, which resulted in the transport or deaths of thousands of its citizens and bringing the nation to the brink of starvation. So Mona is just there, this like Nova Scotian ex-showgirl, and she's just like, what the fuck? Like more unprecedented times? More unprecedented times? World War II? Who knew there'd be another one? But she's married to this millionaire. She's a wealthy socialite. And she was like, she felt it was necessary to find ways to resist and to thwart the Nazi occupation. She wasn't like, she's not going to be, you know, like some of the people in The Sound of Music who are just kind of like, oh, that's, you know what? Like, let them do whatever. We'll just have parties. She's like, fuck no. She's like, she's Christopher Plummer in The Sound of Music. She's ripping the Nazi flag, except in her own way. So she and Willem, who's also on board with like, let's be on the right side of history, which is now, will always be the side opposing the Nazis. So they joined a group of other people who felt the same way and vowed to do whatever they could to counter what the Nazis were up to. This group didn't have a name at the point, but eventually we know them as the Resistance. So what she and Willem were best equipped to do was to let people hide in their house. So it's not an Underground Railroad scenario, but it's kind of an Underground Railroad scenario. So they had this beautiful 3-story house. And I believe the top floor of the house was where all of their servants lived. And they were like, what we need to do is like, we can hide people in that top floor. So first they like regrettably had to let their servants go because they had to use the top floor to like hide people for the resistance. And that is what they did. And the people who they're helping to hide, like what was happening in near Holland, was there's airplane stuff happening, right? Like there's the Allies, including Canadian people, British people, American people, I think. They were flying airplanes over there. And then but there was like Nazi airplanes fighting the airplanes. There's like these airplane battles. And so sometimes the Allied flyers, pilots, the planes would go down and they'd be trapped in Holland. So what Mona and her husband were doing is they were going to, her and the other people in this network, not just them, there is people from all different walks of life, were on board this, be on the right side of history, the anti-Nazi side, teachers, farmers, businessmen, professors. So they gathered false identity papers, ration cards, and civilian clothing, providing accommodation and transportation to get these pilots to coastal villages so they could go back to England. And they'll get back to England on fishing boats. Fishermen are involved in all of this. The fishing boats would take them to the North Sea to rendezvous with British submarines to take them back to England. This is some real spy shit. And they were, Mona and Willem, a crucial part of this. Oh, and this is just clarifying in this as well. So they had to let the servants go, not just because they had to have the pilots hide in the top floor, but also because they didn't want the servants to be implicated in case Mona and Willem got arrested. They didn't want the servants to go down with them. So that is a good reason to fire people, I guess, if you have to. So the Nazis, what the fuck is this world? The Nazis, who again, to clarify, are the bad guys in this story and now and every story, they were class conscious. They like Mona and Willem were like gorgeous, rich, white people. And so they weren't harassed by soldiers. They were treated with respect because they looked kind of like what Nazis thought people should look like. And the whole the Nazis' vibe at this point was they thought once the upper class, once the rich people could be convinced the Nazis were not a real threat, everyone else would maybe stop fighting the Nazis and the Nazis could take over. Is what they were doing then is similar to what is happening now. If you get all the rich people on board, maybe everyone else will aspire to be like them and stop fighting. Didn't work then, not working now, not going to work ever. So, but because they knew the Nazis were bitches like this, Mona and Willem were just like, we'll use this to our advantage. Like, we'll use our privilege to fight the Nazis. However, by the summer of 1941, the Nazis started to realize that this plan was not going to work. And they also realized, like, oh, there's the resistance. So they started to infiltrate the network. They would arrest people, they would interrogate them, but everyone was covering for everybody. But the part that was getting tricky was moving the pilots from the airmen, from the house to the place to the fishing boat to the submarine. Like, it was just getting more and more difficult to move them around. So they were having to keep them in hiding sometimes, instead of just like coming in the house, moving along really quickly. Sometimes they'd have to hide overnight, and the longer they were there, the more risky it was that you might get caught. By September 1941, Mona and Willem agreed that Willem should go into hiding because they felt like they might be closing in on them. Mona would remain behind in the house, and she would kind of, with her acting skills and with her beauty, she would be able to just be, oh, he went off on a fishing trip. Don't worry about me. Totally not a resistance fighter. And she also stayed behind to care for their 2 dogs, and just to kind of look not suspicious. And their instincts were correct, because the Gestapo arrived at Ingleside and brought her in for some questioning. She was subjected to repeated questioning, but she pulled at all of the classic things that women do when we want to look dumber than we are. She pretended to be confused. She pretended like, oh, my German's not that good, although she spoke like fluent German and also Dutch. But then they were like, actually, we have files with details about people that you know. In fact, we just found this guy, this British pilot who's just staying at your house, and he had a business card in his pocket with your name and phone number on it. So she was kind of fucked. She was put into solitary confinement, and she was held for 3 months without charge in this terrifying situation. And then one day, some guards came in and they're like, guess who's on trial today? You are. And she was taken to trial. She didn't have a consultation with a lawyer. She didn't know what the charges against her were. And the whole trial was being done in German, which she understood. But like, in this situation, like, she spoke German, but it's some technical language. But she did understand when they found her guilty and sentenced her to death by firing squad. You might be looking at the length of this episode and realizing the story doesn't end here. So hang on. And this is what's in the Canadian Heritage Minute. So all of her acting training, her elocution letters, being the Ziegfeld Folly, she stood there, cool as anything. She remained calm. She bowed her head slightly, clicked her heels together, and all that she said was Guten Morgen, meinen Herren, a phrase I know from the musical Cabaret. She's saying, good morning, sir, basically. And she was so calm and cool about it, and took this like so well, and was just, I don't know, just beautiful, her elocution. The chief judge of the tribunal was so impressed, he followed her from the courtroom. And he was like, okay, you're being transferred to this other prison to be killed by a firing squad, but I will permit you to appeal your sentence because you're such a classy broad. And so she was given writing materials upon her return to the prison. So she wrote her appeal, and in fact, it worked. Her death sentence was commuted to life in labor camps. This was 1 month before her 41st birthday, just so we're all keeping track of how old she was. So she's taken with other prisoners to a train station, and then she's being moved to a different prison, a concentration camp, labor thing. And so she moved to this labor camp where she worked on an assembly line creating plywood wings for small craft, and then on the line assembling igniters for bombs. While she was there, she became ill with bronchitis several times, and then, because it's like a prison working camp. So even when she was in the hospital, she was still tasked with doing more work, and the work that they got her to do was to knit socks for the German soldiers. Remember, she knit socks for soldiers in World War I, so it's a skill she had. She derived great satisfaction by breaking the wool frequently when not watched, so there'd be holes in the socks. And she'd also incorporate large knots of wool in the soles of the socks to make them uncomfortable. Any act of defiance, regardless of how small, was enough to buoy her spirits to help her survive. And I feel like that's a good reminder for us all. Every little bit of fuck you energy is valuable, especially if it brings you joy. So, 1945, February 6th. All the prisoners in this prison camp were herded onto a train they're just switching them to a different labor camp, I guess. And while she was waiting to switch to the other train, she suddenly saw Willem, her millionaire husband, among the other prisoners being put on another train. She hadn't seen him since, remember, he left at that one point when they thought he was going to be arrested. She didn't know what had happened to him. She didn't know if he was alive or dead. So he had been eventually arrested. Without thinking of the consequences, she ran to him, threw her arms around him, embraced him, and she's able to say, "Have courage, my love," in Dutch before they were parted again. At the next prison, these prisons are all shitty, overcrowded, sleeping 4 in a cell designed for 1, very little food. The toilet was a bucket in the middle of the floor. Things were terrible, obviously. And then, shortly after her arrival at this prison, I believe it was this prison, another small group of prisoners arrived. One young woman caught her eye. This was Wendelin von Botzelaar, a 22-year-old baroness and university student who had been rounded up because of her involvement in the resistance. She didn't initially know that that's who Wendelin was. But Mona saw this one woman was being treated differently. She's not allowed to join the other prisoners for meals or exercise. She's being kept in solitary confinement like Mona had been. And so she tried to make contact, even if only to boost this young woman's spirits and to let her know, you have a friend in me. So at the end of one time when Mona was working in the kitchen shift, she slipped a cooked potato into a secret pocket she had sewn into the skirt of her uniform for this purpose. A secret potato smuggling pocket. And she got the potato to the woman, and the woman answered the gift, and then they became friends. So Wendelin, later on recalled, 50 years later, what impressed her about Mona, even in the situation, where you're emaciated, spirits are broken down, you've been in Nazi prison camps for years. Wendelin remembered she had this profound life force. She also had a great repertoire of songs, probably from the Ziegfeld Follies. She knew naughty songs, she knew happy songs, she just knew how to keep spirits up. So together, Mona was okay, I'll take you under my wing, here's how this prison, here's what's up. So the prison director, Mona had discovered, was a lesbian, and as such was not sympathetic to the Nazis' persecution of homosexuals. And this lesbian prison warden she had some compassion for most of the women in her charge, although she was not willing to risk her life or position for them. But as long as she was in charge, it's things could be worse. And that she was she took care of the women in some ways. Mona persuaded, perhaps with her beauty and her elocution, this lesbian prison warden to let Wendelin out of the cell to join the rest of the prisoners, to incorporate herself with everybody else, to take meals and exercise and stuff. And she taught her how to make a potato pocket, I guess, because when assigned to kitchen duties, both women smuggled pieces of cooked potatoes to share with other women assigned to other tasks in the prison. And soon, Mona and Wendelin, I've never seen this name before, Wendelin, they're we're going to bust out of here. We are going to escape from here. Wendelin, I'm going to say it like that now, I don't know, was the one who's we are going to get the fuck out of here. And Mona's how are we going to do that? I'm game, but what's the plan? And Wendelin was I don't know. But when an opportunity presents itself, we both have to be ready to seize that opportunity. And they're both got it. We got potato pockets, and we're going to bust out of this Nazi prison. We are resistance fighters, and we got this. So just after the middle of March of this year, which I think is 45, yes, Mona and Wendelin noticed there was more planes than usual in the skies above their prison. So they're okay, I guess we're in the war, and I guess there's going to be an air attack probably. So probably these other planes are on missions, bombing some other places. They're going to bomb us next. And so Wendelin and Mona are just this could be our chance. So Wendelin is just ooh, lesbian prison director, could I have a sweater? Because it's so cold and I'm so emaciated here in this prison. My rheumatism is please can I have my sweater, please? And the lesbian prison director let her have it. The real reason Wendelin wanted this was because when the time came to escape, she didn't want to be out there in her prison garb. She wanted to blend in with the local population and not look suspicious. And because she was able to get the sweater, Wendelin encouraged Mona to ask for her shoes for the same reason. So in prison, they were wearing wooden clogs. And Mona's they don't keep my feet warm. Could I please have shoes? And if the prison director suspected the real reason, she never let on. But I don't know, I'm picturing, I don't know a lot of women's prison wardens, but I'm picturing Queen Latifah from the Chicago movie, but Nazi white person version. And so they got the sweater, they got the shoes, and then suddenly the Allies did in fact attack the prison. So panicking, the director was just like, oh my God, like my girls, like I gotta take care of my girls. And so she unlocked the prison gates and she was just like, okay, prisoners, you have a choice. You can either go into the prison's bomb shelter or take your chances outside amid the active bombing situation and gunfire. And Vendeline and Mona were just like, this is our chance. And they ran outside. So they headed in what they thought was towards the west, towards Holland. Without a map or a compass, they couldn't be sure of where they're going exactly. And these two had skills, and I don't doubt them for a minute, but they'd been through a lot. They hadn't been eating a lot. And neither of them, like an heiress slash medical office assistant slash showgirl, and then this like baroness, like, do they know how to read the stars? I don't know. Anyway, as night approached, they found shelter in the barn of a deserted farm. And so they removed as much of their prison clothes as they could, buried it in the mud, and then set about to pretend to be non-prisoner German people. Vendelian spoke German fluently, and so she was like, here's the plan. We're going to play, because Mona was like early 40s. Vendelian is like 20 years younger. So it's like, we're going to play like an aunt and her niece. Because Mona spoke German with a Canadian accent, that would be suspicious and make her seem like the enemy. So it's like, you can't talk. So what we're going to do is like, you'll be the aunt, but you're going to pretend you have a cleft palate and you're mute. And also you are intellectually challenged. And Mona is just like, I am an actress. I can perform this role of a lifetime, and I shall. So for the next 3 weeks, they walked across Germany. Their shoes eventually gave out. They had to walk barefoot. They begged for food and lodging at farms along the way, offering their physical labor as payment, which it's like, don't know where the strength is coming from their inner badassness. They were nearly caught a few times, finally reached the village of Riede on the Dutch-German border. So they went to see the town burgomaster, which I think is like the mayor, who is like, where are you from? Where are you from, glamorous young woman and your cleft palate aunt who is mute? Vendeline said, we're refugees from Dusseldorf, but we lost our identity papers when we fled from our city. And the burgomaster was like, sounds good to me. So he gave them new papers and arranged lodging for them at 2 separate farms. Mona was nervous to be separated, but now she had to pretend to be this cleft palate mute German person without Vendelian there to like emotionally support her. So she was taken to this farm, lived in by a farmer, his wife, and their 6 children. She had to share the bed of the eldest girl, who was 12. This girl was not kind to Mona. All the children were mean to her, thinking that she was this like cleft palate dummy. But she couldn't resist what they were doing. She couldn't discipline them because that would give up the act. She couldn't talk. Anyway, during the first few days, she could hear that there was artillery fire in the distance. And one day, the artillery fire moved closer until it was all around them. So the farmer said, okay, everybody, and you, cleft palate aunt, go into the cellar. Mona, who had been in solitary confinement in that first prison for like 3 months. She was just like, her PTSD. She's just like, she wouldn't do it. Like, she wouldn't do it. So she and the farmer stayed upstairs. At one point, there was a lull in the fighting. The farmer took a plate of food out to a young soldier near the house. As Mona watched, a shell burst and he and the soldier died. She ran to the cellar with the family, and the 2 of them were dead in the ditch. So Mona helped the farmer's wife, even though this family had been assholes to her. It's like the outer space slug situation. It's like, well, I guess we're a team now. So she helped the farmer's wife carry the farmer's body into the house, laid on the sofa, and then panicked neighbors came through with news that the Poles were advancing. Everyone needs to gather what you can and flee into Holland. So she helped the farmer's wife, again, Mona, helping people selflessly, and also saving herself. So they put whatever they could into a cart and they guided it across this marshy patch into Holland. They spent a cold night in hay in a field until a Dutch farmer collected them to take them to his home. Once she was back in Holland, Mona was like, okay, shake it off. I'm me again. I'm not the cleft palate person. It's me, Mona Parsons, glamorous, wife of a millionaire, resistance fighter, accredited nurse, ex-showgirl, and I'm also Canadian. So she said, like, I'm a Canadian. I'm married to a Dutch national. Please help me find the British troops. They will help me. And one of the first things she did, this is 1945. So for the last 2 years, she hadn't been able to contact her father who she had been able to keep in touch with via the Red Cross. So she sent word to him, like, guess what? I'm still alive. So the Dutch farmer and his wife, nicer people than the last ones, bandaged her badly damaged feet from all the walking on foot for weeks and gave her a pair of wooden clogs to wear. Wooden clogs are going to come up again in the story. They packed her lunch, and the farmer's brother took her on the back of his bicycle to where there were some nearby British troops. Mona went up to them, and they're just like suspicious, like, because everyone's suspicious of everyone. And she's like, you guys, no, like, okay, so first of all, the Dutch farmer's brother thought these were British troops. Mona went up to them, and she's like, you guys, I'm from Canada. Please help me, British troops. And the soldier's like, where are you from in Canada? And she's like, I'm from Wolfville in Nova Scotia. And he was like, this is a quote, my name is Clarence Leonard. I'm from Halifax. We are the North Nova Scotia Highlanders. Nova Scotians, only 1 to 2 degrees of separation from each other. They're just like, fuck, we're Nova Scotian here in the middle of the war in Holland. So anyway, she was then taken for further questioning because it's like, is she lying? Is she a spy? But then, so they, like, the Nova Scotia guys took her to the British people. One of the British people heard that she claimed to be from Wolfville, Nova Scotia. And he was like, oh, one of my guys is from, had attended Acadia University in Wolfville. So he went to find this guy, Captain Vincent White. Anyway, and in fact, he did, because he had acted with her in some of the plays back in Wolfville. And he's just like, what the fuck is Mona Parsons doing here, this glamorous actress person? Anyway, everyone's excited. The Nova Scotia connection is coming fast and furious. And basically, it's just kind of like she's having her feet tended to, like they're sores, whatever. Things are like not great foot-wise. But anyway, it was arranged for her to be transferred to a residence for Canadian nurses. She met up there with Captain Robbins Elliott, whose father back in Wolfville had been Mona's family's physician. It's bananas to me. People meeting people. It happens today. It happens to me. But for her in the story, it's just like, it's unbelievable, really. But this is what happened. So while in the hospital, she wrote a 34-page letter to her father and stepmother, her first communication with them since 1943. Like the Red Cross had, I guess, communicated telegrams, but this was her first. And these letters still exist. And this is how we know a lot of what happened with her. So a few days later, her friends arranged for her to have like a little journey away from the hospital, a little fun day, a field trip. Along for this ride to cover the story for the Toronto Telegram was a war correspondent named Alan Kent, who was also from Halifax, Nova Scotia. And during this trip, she had a tearful reunion with her dog, who survived the war. But at most in her mind, Willem, like, where's her husband? Is he alive? Is he dead? Like, what's happening? Several days went by before her brother-in-law confirmed that Willem had been liberated. He was still alive. He had been liberated from a camp by American soldiers, and his services as a translator had been engaged by the American military. So that July, Mona and Willem were finally reunited in Laren, I presume at Ingleside, because that's where their house was. So in the early months after the war ended, she received 2 citations of, like, she's great. The first was on behalf of the British people, thanking her for her role in aiding members like the airmen who she had helped get to the fishermen and the submarines by hiding them in her house. The second was signed by General Dwight Eisenhower, expressing the gratitude of the American people for everything that she had done to help out the war effort. And so it was, she truly had been given a second chance at life, and she was intent on embracing it fully. So, you know, she and Willem both had to work at regaining their health after everything they'd been through, and she bounced back better than Willem did. He struggled. He was quite depressed. He ate not much, and he began drinking heavily. In the 1950s, like, they stayed there. Her brother Ross and his wife visited in the 1950s, and they were shocked by Willem, by the condition he was in. He did not come downstairs for breakfast. When he rose later in the morning, he just drank from dawn till dusk. Mona wrote at one point that he seemed to be, quote, sadistic, though she gave no details. In 1956, Willem became gravely ill, and he was hospitalized in Amsterdam, and he passed away. And then, twist upon a twist, in the days following his funeral, Mona learned that Willem had changed a life insurance policy he had to, it would all go to the wife of his best friend. So she was not going to inherit his money. The wife of his best friend was going to inherit his money. And then she also learned, so Willem had a son from his first marriage who she had thought was illegitimate, but it turns out he was actually legitimate. and he was entitled to 3/4 of the father's estate. So Mona was left with nothing other than the things she personally owned: her clothing, her jewelry, some furniture, and some shares in Willem's company. And this is why, ladies, it's important to have your own bank account and your own assets. And I know, like, back in this era, women couldn't own property and things, but this, you don't want to be left like Mona. You can't assume your husband's gonna not be a shit at the end of it. So she had the title to Ingleside, the House of Dreams, but without funds, like, she couldn't maintain the house, so she had to sell the house. And so she left Ingleside May 5th, 1957, moving into a hotel. So through all of this, and kind of reminding me a bit of last time when we were talking about Viola Desmond, Mona was just like, fuck this. Holland, I'm over it. And she left and she went back to Nova Scotia, where she stayed at the Lord Nelson Hotel, a hotel that is still there. I've eaten there at the restaurant, the Victory Arms. It's a good little restaurant. Anyway, so eventually she settled into an apartment on Inglis Street, which is right in the neighborhood where I grew up. Never heard of this woman. Never heard of her. Hang on for this next thing. So on Inglis Street, where she lived, one of her neighbors was an old friend, Major General Harry Foster. A person named Foster living on Inglis Street in Halifax could also describe myself. I mean, Major General Harry Foster, no relation that I know of, but like everything I've just told you about Nova Scotia, like clearly some relative of mine, must be. Anyway, Harry Foster, my ancestor, he was like, oh my God, Mona, hey, like I remember seeing you at the hospital in Holland where he served after the war. Anyway, he's just like, oh, we met, remember at the hospital that time. He was retired / divorced, which means single. And the two were just like, they happily got reacquainted, quote unquote. They got married. He supported her legal battle for this whole like inheritance bullshit. And by 1961, she lost the battle. She did not get any of the money. And then 3 years later, my ancestor, Harry Foster, died of cancer. So she is a single lady, again, a widow twice over. She lived at their house near the Chester Golf Club until she decided to sell that house, but continued to live in it as a tenant. She wanted to travel more. And by 1966, she decided to return to Europe, the first time since she left in 1957. She renewed some friendships and just kind of like felt some closure about that whole part of her life. In 1969, she was in a car accident on the icy roads just before Christmas. And she thought, it's not great to be living in this rural area that doesn't have public transit. I don't want to have to be depending on a car when she's old and living by herself and with icy, slippery roads. So she decided to return to Wolfville, where she hadn't lived for many years, but she'd made many happy memories there. And I've been there, like there's a beautiful like downtown. It's very walkable. So she got an apartment on Main Street in 1970 within walking distance of the shops and the university. And she thought she might take some courses there, do some senior learning. As she was aging, at this point, she's like in her 70s. She developed emphysema and had some small strokes. Remember, her mother died of stroke as well. This affected her memory and her ability to speak. But during that time, and also prior to that time, while she was living in Wolfville, she was just like a colorful local person. She'd been a Ziegfeld Follies girl. Like she had all these adventures and she told people her adventures. She's this like kooky older lady in Wolfville. And this is where the people in Wolfville today, or the woman who wrote the book, like she talked to people who knew her in the 70s. So it's like, this is how her story lived on because she was just this local character in this last era of her life. As her health and memory declined, she began to experience nightmares and flashbacks like PTSD, particularly at night. She would have night terrors. She would believe herself to be a prisoner of war once again. And then eventually she died in the hospital, November 28th, 1976, where she is buried in Willowbank Cemetery, I believe in Wolfville. Her epitaph reads, Mona L. Parsons, 1901 to 1976, wife of Major General Harry Foster, CBEDSO. That is what it says. There's no mention of her own citations, of her own heroism, of her own story. And the end of that epitaph where it says CBEDSO, those are the citations that Harry got for his military career. He's not buried there with her. He's buried with his first wife in Kentville, about 16 kilometers away. People who listen to my regular podcast, Vulgar History, will know there was a famous episode, famous to me, famous to the listeners, I did about a French before France was France, about this queen called Fredegund and her tomb. And she did these incredible things. Talk about like a twist and a turn. Her grave is just like, Fredegund, she was the mother of a king. And it's like, oh, like to see a woman with such a story to just be like, how many women are in, who even get graves? Lots of people don't get graves, but how many people are just like, oh, she was the wife of so-and-so, where it's like, no, she was this whole ass person. Like who she was married to was the least interesting thing about her. A brief tangent since I'm already rambling. One of the people in my personal life who I consider and will consider an enemy for as long as I live, I do not wish harm upon him now because he's already had a downfall that I did not cause. But when it happened, I was glad because this is probably like 15 years ago. I was at a house party that this guy was also at, and he was in one room with some people and I was in the other room. And just as I was coming from one room to the room he was in, I overheard what he said. And what he said was, oh, what's her face? Joe's girlfriend. And at the time, and at the now, I do have a boyfriend whose name is Joe. That has not come up on the podcast because it's not the My Life Story podcast. But when I heard him say, oh, what's her name? Joe's girlfriend. I was just like, I'm going to destroy this man's life. Like, what's her face? Joe's girlfriend? That's the energy of Mona Parsons' grave to me. At least it says her name. It's not what's her face. Harry Foster's wife. But like, to dismiss a woman as like, oh yeah, she's like this accessory to this man. It's just like, no thanks. But this is where the author of where I got all this research from, Andrea Hill-Lair, who wrote a book, Mona Parsons, From Privilege to Prison, From Nova Scotia to Nazi Europe. And she has this website, monaparsons.ca. Like Andrea has been advocating to celebrate this woman's story, and she has had so much success because look at the story. So in 2005, Historica Canada released a heritage minute on Mona Parsons it shows her arrest and her eventual escape. And in 2017, a statue in her honor was erected in Wolfville. And it's of her dancing wearing wooden clogs. I told you the wooden clogs were going to come back, and they did. The statue is called The Joy is Almost Too Much to Bear. And that's a quote from the letter that she wrote to her family at the time that that Holland was liberated. The joy is almost too much to bear. So it's this joyful statue. I love that this is the statue. It's not like her standing there. She wasn't an army person. She wouldn't be standing there in an army uniform. She's just dancing in wooden clogs, joyfully. Just this kind of like kooky, you can see like the vibe of what she was like. And she was a dancer, right? Ziegfeld Foley's dancer. Anyway, this statue was advocated for and the funds were raised for by the Wolfville Historical Society and the Women of Wolfville community group. The statue was made by local artist Nistel Prem de Boer, who is also Dutch. And in November 2023, Mona Parsons was featured on a Canada Post stamp. And when I was asking my mother what she knew about this person, it just had never come up in my conversations with my mother, who lives in Nova Scotia, she's like, oh yeah, no, I bought the stamps. And she still has the stamps because they're cool stamps. So that is today's extra long Vulgar History Canadian Heritage Minutes. Was that an hour? Canadian Heritage hour. Couldn't skimp on any of the details. There's so much more detail on monaparsons.ca that you can get more. I tried to make it as concise as I could while still celebrating this person. So if there's anything that I learned from this story and that I hope you learn from this story, it's that this woman was an icon. She was a legend. Women contain multitudes. Your life can have multiple eras. If all that you can do is knit some socks with some knots in them to make someone's feet uncomfortable, do that. Like small acts of resistance. I'm just trying to summarize everything we talked about. Nazis are always the bad guys. And basically, don't fuck with Canada. Thank you. I'll be back with some more of these heritage minutes. If you have suggestions of women from Canadian history who you want celebrated, who you want to hear me yell about passionately with vocal fry, let me know. I'm on, if you go to vulgarhistory.com, there's like a contact me email button there, or I'm on Instagram. You can email me or DM me on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod. Anyway, regular episode coming up on Wednesday. And some more of these goddamn episodes until the horrors cease. I'm going to keep swearing and telling these goddamn stories so everybody knows that Canada is not to be fucked around with. Tits out, elbows up. Take care. Vulgar History is researched, written, and hosted by Anne Foster. That's me. The editor is Christina Lumagi. The music is by the Severn Duo. The Vulgar History Show image is by Deborah Wong. Transcripts are written by Aveline Malik. Find transcripts of recent episodes at vulgarhistory.com.
I'm Amy Nicholson, the film critic for the LA Times.
And I'm Paul Scheer, an actor, writer, and director. You might know me from The League, Veep, or my non-eligible for Academy Award role in Twisters.
We love movies, and we come at them from different perspectives.
Yeah, like Amy thinks that, Joe Pesci was miscast in Goodfellas, and I don't.
He's too old. Let's not forget that Paul thinks that Dune 2 is overrated.
It is.
Anyway, despite this, we come together to host Unspooled, a podcast where we talk about good movies, critical hits,
fan favorites, must-sees, and in case you missed them.
We're talking Parasite to Home Alone.
From Grease to The Dark Knight.
We've done deep dives on popcorn flicks. We've talked about why Independence Day deserves a second look.
And we've talked about horror movies, some that you've never even heard of, like Ganja and Hess.
So if you love movies like we do, come along on our cinematic adventure.
Listen to Unspooled wherever you get your podcasts.
And don't forget to hit the follow button.
Hi, this is Rob Benedict.
And I am Richard Spate. We were both on a little show you might know called Supernatural.
It had a pretty good run, 15 seasons, 327 episodes.
And though we have seen, of course, every episode many times, we figured, hey, now that we're wrapped, let's watch it all again.
And we can't do that alone, so we're inviting the cast and crew that made the show along for the ride. We've got writers, producers, composers, directors, and we'll of course have some actors on as well, including some certain guys that played some certain pretty iconic brothers.
It was kind of a little bit of a left field choice in the best way possible.
The note from Kripke was, he's great, we love him, but we're looking for like a really intelligent Duchovny type.
With 15 seasons to explore, it's going to be the road trip of several lifetimes. So please join us and subscribe to Supernatural then and now.
Hello, I am Kristen Russo.
And I am Jenny Owen Youngs.
We are the hosts of Buffering the Vampire Slayer once more with Spoilers, a rewatch podcast covering all 144 episodes of, you guessed it, Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
We are here to humbly invite you to join us for our 5th Buffy prom, which, if you can believe it, we are hosting at the actual Sunnydale High School. That's right. On April 4th and 5th, we will be descending upon the campus of Torrance High School, which was the filming location for Buffy's Sunnydale High, to dance the night away to 90s music in the iconic courtyard, to sip on punch right next to the Sunnydale High fountain, and to nerd out together in our prom best inside of the set of Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
All information and tickets can be found at bufferingcast.com/prom. Come join us.